Now, if someone's listening to the show and they're like, okay, I think I'm familiar with capital gains and taxes, but like, what is an unrealized capital gain? Exactly. I would go so far to say is unrealized capital gains is just theft.
Why isn't there pushback, like crazy pushback?
Common sense, what has always been the policy in the US is that like, okay, but you don't actually pay taxes until you sell. This was done in Norway a couple years ago. So we're not talking theory here. This was done in Norway, where just like Kamala is proposing, it was only applied to the top 1%. More people fled Norway, like literally just left the country with all their money in 1 year in 2022 than had previously left in the 13 years combined. The United States economy is, orders of magnitude larger than Norway's, so the economic destruction that this would create would have ripple effects across the world.
I don't think people realize like how damaging or fragile this could be.
What we need in society are more Republicans, conservatives, whatever you want to call them, that are willing to call out Trump when he's wrong on economics issues.
Yes.
And what we need are more Democrats,
Yes.
liberals, progressives, whatever you want to label
Agreed.
them, who are willing to call out the crazy ideas that Kamala has. It is probably the most crazy policy proposal ever put forward by any presidential candidate ever.
If you're watching this and want to grow or become wealthy, like these ideas matter. So we can talk about strategies all day long, but a lot of times strategies are predicated on an environment that allows us to be able to do them.
This idea of unrealized capital gains, that's part of Kamala's tax plan. Unrealized capital gains. Now, if someone's listening to the show and they're like, okay, I think I'm familiar with capital gains and taxes, but like, what is an unrealized capital gain? Exactly. It's a complete made up fairy tale phrase, frankly, that's super far left. I'm going to use the phrase communist because that's what it is. Like, it's wealth confiscation. So that's actual communism. It's not an income tax. It is actual communism where you're just taking assets from other people. It's a wealth tax. Right? They say that, let's say you have mutual funds and you have $1 million, starting on January 1st of whatever year this law goes into effect. So your basis is $1 million. If your portfolio doubled from $1 million to $2 million because you were really good at picking stocks or the market went up or inflation, frankly, you now have a capital gain of $1 million, right? But common sense, what has always been the policy in the US is that like, okay, but you don't actually pay taxes until you sell, right? Because maybe that gain goes down in some years, and maybe all of a sudden you lose money and you're down to 800,000. So you've actually lost some of your principal. You don't pay any taxes until you actually sell because you don't have any money.
And
right?
hence the word realize when you
realize the profit.
Yeah.
And so what this unrealized capital gains, this BS, is that if your portfolio increases by, let's say, $1 million, they want to tax that at 25%. So even though you never sold, you don't have any extra money in your checking account. If your portfolio increases by 25%, you would owe $250,000 in taxes, which means you probably have to sell some of those stocks every year just to pay the taxes. So like putting it in a real world example, let's say Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, obviously the vast majority of Jeff Bezos's wealth is in Amazon stock.
Yep.
If it goes up a ton in value, it would force him to start selling his stock just to pay the taxes, which actually drives down the price for everyone else who owns that stock. And some of the biggest shareholders of Amazon stock across the country are pension funds and boomers trying to retire own a bunch of Amazon. So it actually like forces down the market when wealthy people have to do that. I mean, it is probably the most crazy policy proposal ever put forward by any presidential candidate ever. It is so laughable that you could tax. It's a wealth tax. It's basically saying, hey, there's people that are richer than I am, and I'm mad that they're richer than I am.
Did Kamala, did she explain anything more, or was it just a talking point? Did she like explain how? Because it's like, I think mutual funds I actually could push back on and say like, you could argue that that's why people like Ross or deferral accounts, because you do have to pay taxes as you sell, because a lot of times you're rebalancing and all. But homes, that's a good example. You're in a home, it appreciates just because it grows in value. Like now,
doesn't mean you have any more money.
Exactly. And then the great example is if you own a company, like technically someone could say the company is worth X and it grew in value, which that's my hope, is that BetterWealth grows in value every year. I would not have the liquidity if I had to pay tax on something that I'm not going to realize, because if I realized it,
you would have to sell part of the company.
Right. Which would be like, so my question would be is, why isn't there pushback, like crazy pushback? Also, I want to be like, for anyone that follows me knows that I'm a conservative Christian, like to be open-minded. I have people I'm willing to talk on all sides. Okay. So I'm not going to try to hide behind me being like, I'm an independent thinker on all these issues. I try to be very open-minded. If you are watching this and you're like, hey, they got something wrong when it comes to like, this is the pitch to why this is good for our country, please reach out and I would love to have you on and maybe the three of us can talk. Okay. So I just want to be very open. Like I'm open to both sides here, but why aren't there people on the Democratic side or just period talking about this? Because I think one of my biggest problems with this election so far is it seems like the issues are border, which, trust me, I think both sides would even agree that's a point that's being made valid. Abortion on the other side, which there's a lot of misinformation about, like, that deal. Yeah. But it seems like the talking points are very shallow. Like on the other side, it's like, women, race, all these things. Okay. But it's like, if we actually look deeper, some of the things that you even mentioned are a big deal no matter who you vote for. Like this could literally affect like America's well-being from a standpoint of like the wealth that we experience just by being American. And I don't think people realize like how damaging or fragile this could be based on some bad policies. And like it could literally just wipe out the wealth we've experienced to date.
I think the reason that Democrats on the left aren't calling her out and aren't questioning the sanity of this policy is the same reason that when Trump says something crazy, usually you don't see Republicans saying, oh, that's a bad idea, I don't agree with that. Like, for example, tariffs, right? If you've ever cracked open an economics textbook, you know that tariffs are a bad idea. It's just a tax on consumers, right? So like I plan on voting for Trump in the fall, but I'm also perfectly willing to say where I disagree with him, because I'm not just like, oh, I'm voting Republican because Democrats are stupid and yay, Republicans. Like, no, like Republicans also have some really, really bad ideas from time to time. And tariffs are one of them. I think it's an interesting debate on whether we could fund the government with income taxes versus tariffs. If we got rid of income taxes and replaced it with tariffs. But what we all know is they would never do that. They would just add tariffs on top of all the income taxes coming in. So like, that's just one example of something I disagree with Trump on. I don't think that, raising tariffs is good.
And just for the listener who may like not fully understand tariffs are like a tax on, let's say, China.
On imports.
And so it's pretty much making it more expensive to bring things in, because this idea is we want made in America. We don't want to quote unquote steal jobs. But what you're essentially doing is you're taking something that would cost the consumer, $5, and now I have to pay $8 because, China's not, or whoever is not going to lose money. So they're just going to increase prices, which is it's like inflation. It's a silent tax on everybody.
Yep. It's basically a silent sales tax that doesn't show up on your receipt as being a sales tax, but that's right. Absolutely what it is. It's like if Trump or the US government wanted to create more jobs in the TV manufacturing industry, and they're mad that Samsung makes all their TVs in South Korea, or that Sony builds things in Japan, or, whatever, they'd say, hey, we're going to put a tariff on any imported TV. It's like, well, guess what? Almost all TVs are imported. They're not made in the USA, right? And so if they slapped a huge tariff, essentially a tax on imported TVs, yes, it might absolutely create jobs in America for Americans to build TVs, like made in the USA TVs, because now they could compete on more of a level playing field with foreign imports because you're just artificially making those foreign imports more expensive, right? But it means that TVs are now more expensive for Americans. So it's like, do we want to create more American jobs in industries that frankly aren't great jobs? Like those aren't $100,000 a year jobs. They're like low level manufacturing jobs that are not really paying great wages. Right. And so just from a free market perspective, the reason I went down that rabbit hole is that that's an example of like Republicans, Trump in this instance, having a bad idea that all economists disagree, both left and right. Tariffs are not good for the economy, but you actually do see some Republicans call out Trump saying, hey, I don't agree with that, and here's why. You really don't see that on the left. You don't really see that with Democrats. When Kamala says things that are just like crazy, you don't really see a lot of Democrats saying, hey, I disagree with her on that, and here's why. And this is actually to Democrats' advantage. Politically, Democrats are much better than Republicans at rallying behind their candidate and not questioning things and just saying, hey, we're going to support her, whatever she says. That's not necessarily a good thing because it means that the party drifts more radical over time because no one is ever questioning how good these policies are. It's all about winning. But it means that Democrats have an inherent advantage in winning elections because they're much more team players than Republicans are. And that's just a fact. Like most Republicans do not rally around their candidate the way that Democrats do, and that gives Democrats an advantage.
A good example of this is what happened to Joe Biden. I mean, you could never do that, number one, with Trump. You could never do that with Trump. But most of the time there would be there would be the hypocrisy that like it's interesting. Like when you think of Democrats, you think of like one of their talking points is Republicans are gonna like steal elections and like democracy is going away. And it's like democracy is going away. That's a very interesting talking point as you guys literally booted Joe Biden.
That let's call it what it is.
Vote for her, but now like you're essentially making it where like nobody can compete. You literally have RFK, who if you had a regular primary would be a part of this thing. You're pushing him out. In fact, you're suing him in multiple states
to
trying
keep
to bleed him out to have him not have a voice, which is another thing I want to talk about after you share your talking points here. Is like, why are they, you would think if you were a Democrat, you would want to like secretly have RFK Jr. like help him get support because of just what you just said is like, I think he hurts Donald Trump way more than he does.
He absolutely does. He absolutely does.
Then why is the Democrats making it so difficult for?
Because they don't like dissent and they don't like that he is a fellow Democrat that is like challenging the status quo of the DNC. Like they don't want there to be dissenting voices that call out their hypocrisy. By the way, in the same way, to be fair, that when Ron Paul ran for president in 2008 and 2012, the RNC completely stamped him out and basically cheated in the Iowa caucuses and a lot of those early states to keep Ron Paul from winning because he was such an anti-establishment candidate that, wasn't an old country club Republican that they're like, we will do anything to prevent him from winning. It's what the DNC did to Bernie a couple years ago, where Bernie was actually ahead in a lot of polls, but they said, absolutely not. We can't have Bernie Sanders be the face of the party because he's literally a self-avowed socialist. So, both parties do it. Both parties don't like rebel challengers, but I think it's to the Democrats' advantage in electoral politics that they're much better at being team players and ultimately rallying around their candidate for better or worse, because Kamala has some truly awful ideas. This thing of like unrealized capital gains, again, like I don't hesitate saying that's communism. It is a wealth confiscation
give a 2-minute
tax.
Summary on what price gouging like that.
Yeah, so she's saying price gouging. We're gonna have federal bans on price gouging. In economics, this is called price controls. It's basically the government saying, hey, you can't charge more than $5 for eggs, or more than $8 for milk, or more than $1 for an avocado. It's like the federal government from the top down planning what prices should be. Again, like I am not exaggerating. This is a literal hallmark of communist societies. That's what the Soviet Union did.
In a quote unquote republic democracy kind of deal, that sounds good. Like that's my problem is like you can, to an uneducated person that's listening to this, you're like, oh, you get to stick it to the big people and like they can't raise money, like, or they can't raise prices on things. That sounds really good, Tim. Like that really does. Like that sounds like that sounds great. Why, like, if you don't look at history, like, explain why that's a disaster, and like where companies would just be like, all right, we're going to stop selling, or we're going to like, why would we sell something at a loss and lose money? And it's also ironic that it's the same party that pushes minimum wage and pushes like, you need to pay people what they're worth. And oh, by the way, you can't charge, like, so it's like, well, what's going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, minimum wage is an example of a price control. It's just a price floor versus a price ceiling, right? Either way, you create shortages. That's the one sentence answer of the damage of price controls from an economic perspective, is you create shortages. When if you put a price control on, let's say corn or something, you can't charge more than this for, a bushel of corn or a package of corn, like however you buy corn, I guess, at the grocery store. I'm not sure what quantities it's sold in, but in like agriculture, it's usually quoted in like bushels, right? If you put a price control on that, you then eliminate the incentive for corn producers, corn growers to plant more corn because their profits are limited. They're going to find where they can invest that capital to where they can actually get a reasonable return on capital. With rent control destroys any cities that they institute rent control in, because if you're telling landlords that, hey, I don't care how much money you invest in making your properties better by upgrading the electrical, the plumbing, the wiring, the safety systems, the sprinklers, by upgrading the quartz countertops or the carpets or whatever, that you can only ever charge this amount of rent. Well, you just completely eliminated any incentive for landlords to ever upgrade their properties. So you're actually incentivizing them to become slumlords because they can't charge what they need to charge to upgrade their properties. It also means less construction over the long term, because who would put their hard-earned money into building apartment, units or real estate if there's a cap on what they can charge to get their profit out of that project? So it always sounds good in theory until you spend 2 minutes reading an economics book. And price controls, price controls were the hallmark of the Soviet Union. That is what brought down the Soviet Union, is ultimately you cannot plan an economy from the top down. You just can't.
Yeah. So, but here's the thing: when it comes to quote unquote a democracy, you can say whatever you want to say, and as long as you get the people to vote for you, it's almost like, I guess, what am I trying to say here? It's like you can be right and you can say, hey guys, look at history, or hey, this mathematically doesn't work, but the people that will determine this election are not reading economic books. They're not listening to this show. They're not probably watching much of the news. They're reading one or two headlines. They're hurting financially, most likely. They're frustrated at things, and they're going to vote on one or two issues.
Yeah, I mean, what we need in society are more Republicans, conservatives, or whatever you want to call them, that are willing to call out Trump when he's wrong on economics issues.
Yes.
And what we need are more Democrats, liberals, progressives, whatever you want to label them, who are willing to call out the crazy ideas that Kamala has. The problem is that most people are so tribalistic in how they think about politics that it's like Republicans good, Democrats bad, or Democrats good, Republicans bad.
Yeah.
And they're not actually looking at the actual issues. I mean, I cannot even overemphasize how terrible of an idea taxing unrealized capital gains is, because you're just giving an incentive for people to take money out of the country and invest it elsewhere where it's not going to be just stolen. I mean, I would go so far to say is unrealized capital gains is just theft. It is literally politicians stealing money from people. It's not even an income tax, because at least with an income tax, you can say, hey, I'm just going to reinvest as much money as possible back into my business, or buying real estate, or, I'm going to try to get my taxable income down to zero by just reinvesting. And that actually creates a positive, positive side effect of, if people don't want to be taxed on their income, they then reinvest as much of it as possible so that their, tax rate is lower. That's a good thing for the economy.
Yeah.
The side effect of an unrealized capital gains tax is that's like, well, I don't want my net worth to just be essentially taxed at 25% a year. So I'm going to take my money out of the United States and pull it out of the stock market, pull it out of any businesses I've invested in, and go to some other country where they're not taxing me. So that pushes the stock market down for everyone, down for middle class, senior citizens, teachers, police officers who have pension funds invested in the stock market. It would be devastating for the American economy if anything close to this ever passes.
Yeah.
And this isn't theoretical.
Why do you think she even why wouldn't she just lie and be a quote unquote moderate, and then when she gets into office, she can do whatever she wants? Like,
I think she's showing her true colors, Caleb. The answer is that she's actually so far left that she thinks that these ideas are somehow moderate.
Yeah.
Like, she doesn't realize how crazy radical, again.
That's so interesting.
I'm going to intentionally use the word communist because her father is a Marxist economics professor. Like, he's an economist who self-identifies as a Marxist. So I think she has grown up around these ideas, and her circles, I mean, she's from San Francisco, right?
Yep.
Her circles are so far left politically that she thinks price controls and wealth taxes, like literally just saying, hey, if you're worth $10 million, we'd like to take $2.5 million every year. We're going to take 25% of your net worth, just because we can. I mean, that is communism. Like, I hate throwing that word out because.
So if you were a strategist for the Trump campaign, would you just be hammering the policies? Because clearly, when Trump goes off script and he talks about him being better looking than her or questioning her ethnicity, like, I don't think I don't think that does much for him.
No, if he just focuses on inflation, how bad the economy is, and reminding people that Kamala is the incumbent. Kamala keeps saying she wants hope and change, and on day one, we're going to tackle inflation. It's like, what do you mean day one? You've been vice president for 3.5 years. You are the current administration. Like, right. You need to own the last 4 years are your doing if you want to claim that you've accomplished anything. So if Trump does that, he'll win. So we were talking about RFK earlier. If RFK were to endorse Trump, I think Trump probably wins the election if they can work together, because RFK does have kind of a middle independent-minded coalition of voters that are they're probably more independent-minded.
Do you think if RFK endorses Trump, how much do you think that, like, because I feel like there's a lot of people that just will not vote for Trump, period. And it's interesting that we're talking to you because we're friends. I know you're very critical of Trump. Very critical, which that's what I appreciate. I appreciate the people that can not be like so tribal. They can very much think independently. But I've seen you go from, no, I'm not going to vote for Trump to actually voting for him to now, like, even if RFK Jr. were to stay in the, like, you would, you're in Florida, so it really does not matter at the end of the day, but like, you would put your energy behind Trump mainly because RFK Jr. does not have a chance. And the thought of losing, there's a lot at stake. And so where do you see a lot of your friends who are maybe pro RFK Jr.? What if RFK Jr. was like, hey, I'm endorsing Trump, I'm going to be part of his campaign? Do you think that would do it for most people? The Aaron Rodgers of the world? Like, do you think they would just get in line, or do you think they would just not vote? I
think most people, not all of them, because obviously some RFK, supporters are certainly going to vote for Kamala, and that's fine. Most of them, as in a majority, right, will, I think, vote for Trump if RFK endorses Trump, and Trump says, hey, here's what RFK will be in my administration. He'll be the head of the FDA, or he'll be the head of, whatever. Like, that would put a certain energy behind his campaign. So I think it'd be a really positive thing if you want Trump to win the election.
How many there are Republicans. There were some Republicans that were at the DNC, and there's some Republicans that are like never Trumpers. I know some personally people that I don't necessarily think are going to vote for Democrats, but aren't going to vote for Trump. I think maybe Mike Pence might be a great example of this.
Sure.
How how many of those people are out there, and how damaging could that be? Because that is one thing, in all fairness, Trump is so, like, you have an opinion on Trump, whether you like it or not. And there's some people from an ethical standpoint, or there's some people that are just like, I cannot vote for a man who's so narcissistic, so like, and so like they have these beliefs and they're just like, I can't do it. Do you think they end up, when it's all said and done, when they start seeing like the consequences, do you think they just get in line like most people of like, you got to pick?
I think at least, I can't speak for everyone, but my intellectual journey in terms of how I perceive American politics has really evolved in the last 5 years. I mean, I've always been into the ideas. I've always cared about the philosophy and the economics, but I think I've turned a corner in how I perceive my relationship with politics in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I was like, I took pride in being the super principled guy that won't vote for the lesser of two evils. And I believe my principles. And if, let's say, some random third party candidate who's going to get 1% of the vote, if they agree with my principles, I'll vote for that person. And then I kind of realized, I forget where I read this or who I heard this from, so I can't attribute this to someone, unfortunately, because I honestly just don't remember where I first heard this. But I realized that politics, like American electoral politics, who you vote for president, who you vote for Congress, Senate, or whatever, you're a governor, it's not a philosophy debate. It's a popularity contest. And so you should vote for the candidate who gives your ideas the best chance of winning. Like, which candidate gives your idea the best chance of getting 50+1 in an election and winning? Because it's the what matters is what's the best version of your ideas that can get elected. It's not, notice, it's not what's the best idea. It's what's the best version of your idea that can get elected. And so when you kind of unplug yourself from this political matrix and you realize that, like, okay, like, I believe America should not have income taxes. We didn't have income taxes for basically the first 150 years of the country, and we were fine, right? We need to radically cut government spending. We need to balance the federal budget. That means probably pretty big cuts across the board to the military, Social Security, Medicare. Like, we need to really look at how much debt we're going into and confront the reality of that, of like, what type of debt situation are we leaving for our kids, right? However, I know that no politician who runs on that in 2024 or beyond is going to get elected. So even though that's what I believe, that we have to accomplish all these things, what's the best version of that idea that can actually get elected? And we start there. And then the other, years where it's not an election year, yeah, we talk about culture, we talk about ideas and the philosophy, and we absolutely have those debates. But when it's an election, you don't need to feel like you're selling out if you vote for the best version of your ideas that can win.
Yeah. The two things to just say off of that. Like, a good example is if Trump would say, yeah, our RFK can be in our, we're in our administration. Like, and if you're a fan of some of the ideas that RFK Jr. talks about, it's like, yeah, you might not love Trump, but if you care about the ideas, it's like you can vote for RFK Jr. if you want, but like that voting for RFK Jr. is actually less effective than voting for Trump, who, if elected, will give RFK more of a voice. And
absolutely.
And so
and the same thing is true. I want to point this out because this isn't some like conservative conspiracy theory. The same thing is true if you're on the political left. If you're listening to the show and you're like, hey, maybe I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter and I think we should move more progressive, more socialist in our economic policies. It's like, well, if Bernie Sanders isn't going to win the primary and Bernie Sanders isn't going to be the candidate, you should absolutely be willing to vote for Biden or vote for Kamala if they say, hey, Bernie Sanders will be given a spot in my administration, because that moves the conversation closer to where you believe. So politics is the art of the possible, right? It's what's the best version of your ideas that can win. Speaking of this idea, I want to circle back to something we talked about, because I want to share a real world example with you of how damaging unrealized capital gains are. Because I don't know about you, but I hate rambling about candidates. Like Kamala versus Trump, like that is just so emotionally nauseating. It's like, all politicians suck in both parties. Some of them just suck less than others, right? That's kind of how I think about politics. So let's talk about the actual ideas. This unrealized capital gains. This was done in Norway a couple years ago. So we're not talking theory here. This was done in Norway, where just like Kamala is proposing, it was only applied to the top 1%. Like we're only going to tax the, multimillionaires and billionaires. And they implemented an unrealized, wealth tax, which is what Kamala is proposing. More people fled Norway, like literally just left the country with all their money in 1 year in 2022 than had previously left in the 13 years combined. So they thought that this would actually raise over $100 million of new tax revenue because, they'd be just essentially stealing all the wealth from these rich people. And they thought it would bring in an extra 100 million to pay for all these, new government services, whatever. It actually, tax revenues went down by 500 million. So the government was substantially worse off than before, which obviously means they had to raise taxes on the rest of the population to cover that $500 million, all the people who just left when they started taxing their income. And Norway is a first world country. So I'm not using some example of like a sub-Saharan African tribe, right? Like Norway is a first world country that's comparable to the United States, right? So this has been done before, and that's what happened. The difference is that the United States economy is, orders of magnitude larger than Norway's. So the economic destruction that this would create would have ripple effects across the world if the United States started taxing unrealized. Basically, if you become a wealthy, successful person, it would mean that your number one priority every year isn't how can I save and invest money and be productive and be entrepreneurial and create value for people. Your number one priority every year is how can I dodge taxes? And if the smartest, most ambitious entrepreneurial people in the world, if their number one priority every day when they wake up is what creative shenanigans can I do to dodge taxes, society is worse off for that than if you just gave them a more reasonable tax rate and let them go build companies and innovate scientific ideas and engineering ideas. It would be a tragedy if they did that. And we have Norway to look at as a recent example just in the last 2 years.
So what do you have nightmares about? Tim is having cold sweats at night thinking about unrealized capital gains and price gouging and the ideas. And I do agree that these are not things that are like maybe the biggest talking points. They might soon become talking points, and I hope they're more talked about. But I appreciate you. I want to get just feedback from our audience. Like, do you like conversations like this? I will tell you that while this channel, we talk a lot about, investments, insurance, philosophies there. I tend to be very interested in politics and not the Trump good, Kamala bad, like that. But like, I like talking about ideas. I really like these conversations. This is what I have offline in a lot of cases. And I love talking to people that have all different kinds of beliefs because there's so much that we can learn through this. So if you appreciate this, if you're like, hey, I would appreciate a segment on this channel where we're talking about current events, talking about issues, please let me know. Because obviously I want this to be valuable. And if a bunch of people are like, no, don't do this, Tim, we might just have to start a new channel and have these conversations at it. But I really do believe and hope that, especially as we're coming around the corner to a lot of let's just say a lot of newsworthy talking points, I would love to have a segment where we're just jamming about that. I would love at another time to talk about interest rates. And it's funny. This is another thing I admire about you. You have the most to gain by lower interest rates. You own a mortgage company that makes money off helping people get houses and doing mortgages for them. But yet you also can be objective and say like, hey, just slashing interest rates may or may not be the right thing. When we talked previously, you talked about how interest rates were going to be like that they were going to stay or go up. And now almost all everyone's talking about them coming down. So
Yeah.
we don't have time today, but I would love to talk about that. And I would love to just have a good pulse of like what's going on currently and talking about how this relates to us, and then how this relates to, like, if you're watching this and have a family, if you're watching this and have a business, if you're watching this and want to grow or become wealthy, like these ideas matter. So we can talk about strategies all day long, but a lot of times strategies are predicated on an environment that allows us to be able to do them. And like, even like, we didn't even talk about this, but like the Tax and Jobs Act sunsetting,
Yeah.
like that alone, and again, that alone is so like, it's a huge deal, such a big deal, that I think we need to talk more about it. And I would love to have a whole episode talking about what's actually sunsetting. I'm interviewing Ken Keyes, who's like one of the biggest lobbyists, and like he was like one of the people that helped the qualified income tax benefit. That's probably arguably the greatest benefit to a small business owner. And I'm going to be asking him questions about like what's on the table, what happens with the sunset, and like get his opinion from trying to be as objective as possible, because I believe we need to understand this, and I don't believe there's enough people talking about these subjects, and I think there needs to be more conversations about that. So any final well, I can't talk. Anything that you want to say before we wrap this thing up?
Yeah, I have about an hour of additional thoughts, but two quick things. The SOM rule has just been triggered in economics. I can't remember the economist's first name who came up with this, but their last name is SOM, SAHM. And the SOM rule is a very, very accurate predictor of recessions. And it's like a last minute predictor. So it's not like, oh, we might have a recession in the next 2 years. It's usually when the SOM rule is triggered, a recession happens very shortly. What the SOM rule is that if the unemployment rate in the United States, or the 90-day moving average of the unemployment rate, raises more than 0.5% over its previous 12-month low. So basically, if unemployment increases by more than 0.5%, in a year's time, essentially, a recession will happen very soon. And we triggered that about 2 weeks ago. And so the rate that unemployment is increasing right now, it is incredibly likely that at some point in the next 6 months, we will be descending into an official recession, because unemployment never increases that rapidly all of a sudden and doesn't pull the economy into a recession. So I don't have any opinions I want to share on that. I just want to state that that's probably something that's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. They also revised the job numbers from the first part of the year, and most economists, like the big banks, like Citi and Goldman Sachs and whatnot, are saying that there's actually up to 1 million fewer jobs in the US than we thought we created when they looked further into the data this year. So 1 million. So the economy, in other words, is actually much worse than even they thought it was once they issued the revised reports. And then the second thing I just want to end saying is that really the only way to discuss these issues, talking about unemployment, talking about politics, talking about unrealized capital gains, all these various topics we've bounced around on this session today, a long form interview, like going on YouTube, having a podcast where you talk for an hour, you talk for 2 hours, like on the Joe Rogan show or whatever, and many other shows like that, they talk for 2-3 hours, right? That's the way we should be talking about political issues, social issues, economic issues in this country. It's to our detriment as a society that we've reduced political discourse to these stupid debates where candidates can talk for 60 seconds, because you can't actually get into the issues and the intricacies and the nuance if you're just bound to a 60-second soundbite. And so I would love for Kamala and Trump and RFK and any future elections, 4 years from now, 2 years from now, for it to become more of the norm that, hey, you guys both go on the Joe Rogan show and you talk for 2 hours, or whatever other show, right? Yeah, like a long format interview, so we can actually really hear what you believe, not just the 60-second soundbite that you rehearsed for a CNN debate. We would be way better off. And I think that's true whether you're liberal or conservative, progressive, libertarian. If we could learn more about these candidates in long form YouTube interviews, like that would be really cool.
Yeah, and there's one candidate that's tends to be going on lots of shows, and there's one candidate that's not speaking anything outside of like a script, and that should be telling. And then the other thing that is like probably the biggest issue for me is speech. And I want to be critical on both sides. I feel like Republicans can be very hypocritical when it comes to this, because they're all pro speech until maybe things that they don't like, and then they team up or like say this should be quote unquote banned. But overall, the Republican conservative people are way more open to dialogue, way more open to let's hear all sides. Like, for example, like Joe Rogan, maybe he'll have Donald Trump on the podcast or not, but I think there's a sentiment of like, hey, I don't necessarily want to help someone win kind of deal. But like, I would love nothing more for Kamala to go on Joe Rogan for 3 hours. Like that would be
totally.
I would
and
love
to be
that.
clear, Joe Rogan has this reputation now of like, oh, he's right wing because he knows Elon Musk, or he's interviewed people that are right wing. It's like Joe Rogan has publicly stated he voted for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan is not a right wing conservative. He has publicly stated, I voted for Bernie Sanders, and he also has said he likes RFK, who is a Democrat.
Right.
So it's just a complete myth that someone like Joe Rogan is this right wing conservative.
But the point is, I agree with you around the more conversations, and
absolutely,
that's my hope is, and the thing that is very damaging is if someone gets in power and then their goal is to stop conversation, to ban people from talking, to say like, put labels on someone to try to cut speech out. I think in short term, you can say like, hey, it's a public safety. You're going to be better off. These people are damaging you. And you can put labels on people, put labels on people. And the labels might even be right. Like I'm not I don't agree with everything that's being said on the internet. I do believe that it's a very slippery slope when you determine what is right, what is wrong. And you just look at history and say like that's a really, really slippery slope. And so if there's one issue, and I care about a lot of issues, but there's one issue that I would put the stake in the ground, it's like pro speech rather than less speech. And my hope is I'm an example of that. Hence, I'm opening up my platform to have all kinds of conversations, because I want more talk versus less talk. And I believe we are better off if ideas get shared. Yeah. And not just in their little
whether
bubble.
You're left wing, right wing, progressive, libertarian, if you believe your ideas are better than your opponent's ideas, you should want to be in as many debates and discussions and interviews as possible. And I think it's like you said, Caleb, it's very telling when certain candidates, whether they're on the right or the left, right? When a candidate doesn't want to do debates, they don't want to do town halls, they don't want to appear on a 2-hour long form podcast, that kind of tells you that they're like hiding something,
right?
Because if you're excited about your ideas and you think that your ideas are what's best for society, you should want to talk about them in detail. Yeah. That's one reason I'm optimistic about Gen Z. And mostly I probably sound really pessimist to someone who listens to this episode, right? But one reason I'm long-term optimistic about the country is that Gen Z is so much more demanding of transparency and authenticity, that as the voters right now who are like 21 years old, 25 years old, as they get a little bit older, I think it'll be unacceptable within 5 years, 10 years that a presidential candidate or someone running for governor, Senate, whatever, that it'll be viewed as unacceptable that they're not willing to go on podcasts and be interviewed, because people will demand a certain level of transparency that right now we're letting politicians get away with in both parties. Yeah. So I think that's a good thing that we can look forward to culturally, to end this on a positive note.
Tim, thank you. Again, we want to hear from you in the comments. If you have subjects that you want Tim and I to talk about, please also put that. Tim, thank you, and we'll see you next week.